Clara had always been a skeptic, the kind who rolled her eyes at ghost stories and dismissed urban legends as campfire nonsense. But there she was, driving her beat-up Jeep down a winding road toward the heart of Drevny Bor, a remote forest in Russia known for its dense woods and chilling lore. It wasn't the tales of missing hikers or the whispered warnings from locals that unnerved her. No, Clara was focused solely on her research. She was there to collect samples from ancient trees for her study on climate change, not to get caught up in silly superstitions. The air grew heavier as she approached the forest. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, and the sky, once a crisp blue, faded into a sullen grey. By the time she parked her Jeep at the edge of the woods, the light was already starting to wane. She grabbed her equipment, a flashlight and her notebook before heading into the trees, determined to set up camp before dusk fully settled in. Friday passed uneventfully. Clara collected her samples, made her notes, and settled into her tent with a sense of accomplishment. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, but she attributed it to the remoteness of the area. As she drifted off to sleep, the wind picked up, howling through the trees in a way that sounded almost human. But Clara was too tired to care. Saturday morning, she woke up to a disturbing sight. The ground around her tent was disturbed, like something or someone had been pacing around her camp all night. Deep, uneven footprints, far too large to belong to any animal she knew, crisscrossed the area. A chill ran down her spine, but she brushed it off. Maybe a bear, she thought, or maybe some locals playing a prank. She couldn't let herself be rattled by something so ridiculous. But as the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. She heard things, branches snapping, whispers carried on the wind, that made her heart race. Twice she caught glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The forest felt alive in a way that was far from comforting. As dusk fell on Saturday, Clara's nerves were frayed. She sat by her campfire, clutching a hot cup of coffee, trying to push away the growing dread that gnawed at her. That's when she noticed the eyes. Glowing faintly in the darkness beyond the fire's light, dozens of eyes stared at her from the tree line. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. They were too high up to belong to any normal animal, and they didn't move, just watched, unblinking as if waiting for something. Then all at once they vanished, swallowed by the darkness as if they had never been there. The fire flickered, and the wind carried a low, guttural growl through the trees. Clara's blood ran cold. She was no longer alone in these woods. Something was out there, something malevolent. She retreated to her tent, zipping it up tight, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect her. The night was long, filled with the sounds of scratching against the tent walls, distant wails that seemed to echo through the woods, and that oppressive feeling of being watched. Sleep was impossible. Sunday dawned with an eerie stillness. The forest was dead silent, not even a bird call to break the quiet. Clara emerged from her tent, exhausted and on edge. She needed to get out of there, but her samples weren't complete. Against her better judgment, she ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to finish quickly and leave this place behind. But the deeper she went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to twist and warp, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Shadows slithered across the ground, and Clara swore she heard voices, whispering her name, beckoning her deeper into the forest. Panic set in, and she turned to head back to camp, only to find the path behind her had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. She was lost. The sun dipped low, and the forest grew darker, more sinister. Clara stumbled through the woods, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They filled her head, a cacophony of malevolent voices that clawed at her sanity. She saw things, horrific twisted figures lurking in the shadows, shapes that defied explanation. They taunted her, closing in, driving her toward madness. Just as Clara thought she couldn't take it anymore, she burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient gnarled tree, its bark blackened and scarred. Something about the tree drew her in, despite the overwhelming sense of dread it exuded. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a crude, unsettling mark that pulsed with a dark energy. She knew, without knowing how, that this was the source of the evil that plagued the woods. Desperate, she reached out and touched the symbol. The world around her exploded in a blinding flash of light. The whispers stopped, the shadows fled, and the oppressive presence lifted. Clara collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. When she came to, it was morning. The forest was still, but it was a natural stillness, devoid of the supernatural menace that had stalked her. She was back at her camp, the ancient tree nowhere in sight. Shaking, she packed up her things and left as quickly as she could, not daring to look back. Clara drove away from Drevny Bor, leaving the horrors of the deep woods behind. But the memory of that weekend clung to her like a shadow, a lingering darkness that she couldn't shake. She had survived, but she knew she hadn't escaped. Not entirely. There was a part of her deep down that knew the forest wasn't done with her yet. And as she crossed the border of the woods, she swore she heard a familiar voice whispering her name. Just one last time. The end for now. Sam had been a train driver for 12 years. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He'd seen it all, bloody accidents, crazed passengers, even a few bodies on the tracks. But nothing ever really shook him. Not until that night. It started like any other shift. He was assigned to drive a train through the District 66, a rundown, nearly forgotten area where the tracks creaked like old bones and the stations were more rust than metal. The train itself was a relic, older than sin and just as cursed if you believed the stories. Most drivers avoided it like the plague, claiming it had a history. Sam, he didn't buy into that superstitious bullshit. Trains were machines. They didn't have ghosts. He clocked in, grabbed his worn leather gloves and made his way to the station. The night was colder than usual, a biting wind that carried whispers if you listened too hard. Sam didn't. He just wanted to get the job done, get home, and pour himself a stiff drink. The train stood there, looming in the darkness. Its once red paint had faded to a dull, lifeless maroon. The windows were smudged with something that looked like soot but wasn't. The air around it was thick, almost oppressive. But Sam didn't let it get to him. He was a professional, after all. As he boarded, the cold intensified. He could see his breath now, even though it was the middle of August. He flipped on the lights inside the train, but they flickered like they were resisting him, like they didn't want to show what was lurking in the corners. The control room was just as he expected, outdated but functional. He sat down in the creaky old chair, set his coffee beside him, and began his pre-departure checks. Everything seemed normal. The gauges were where they should be, the brakes responsive, the engine purring along, but there was something off. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way the train hummed, like it had a pulse of its own. Maybe it was the odd sensation of being watched, even though he was alone. Or maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something waiting. The first few stops were uneventful. The usual late-night passengers, a couple of drunkards, a tired nurse, an old man with a face like he'd seen too much. They didn't say much, just slumped in their seats, waiting to get wherever they were going. Sam barely noticed them. He was too focused on that feeling, the one that was gnawing at him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And then came the sixth stop, District 66. Sam hadn't been there before, no reason to. It was one of those places people forgot about, a ghost town in the middle of nowhere. But there was a station there, and he had to stop. The platform was empty, or so it seemed at first. But as he pulled the train to a halt, he saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the edge of the light. A man, maybe, or a shadow shaped like a man. It was hard to tell. The figure didn't move, didn't step closer, didn't signal to board, just stood there watching. Sam felt a chill run down his spine. He opened the doors, even though he didn't expect anyone to get on. And no one did. Not that he could see, anyway. But the train felt heavier, as if someone or something had entered. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Just the empty carriage, the old seats with their frayed fabric, and that persistent, unnerving hum. He shut the doors, more to break the tension than anything else, and set the train in motion. But as they pulled away from the station, he heard it, a low, guttural whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew it wasn't his imagination. He whipped around, expecting to see someone right behind him. No one. But the whispering didn't stop. It got louder, more insistent, like 100 voices speaking at once, all of them angry, all of them desperate. The air grew thick with the scent of something foul, like rotting meat left out too long in the sun. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he felt real, bone-deep fear. He tried to shake it off, tell himself it was just the wind, the creaks of the old train, his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He knew there was something else on that train, something he couldn't see but could feel, creeping closer with every passing second. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The hum of the train turned into a growl, and the controls in front of him started to glitch, the needles on the gauges spinning wildly as if the train itself was panicking. Sam gripped the controls, trying to steady his hands, trying to keep the train on the tracks. But it felt like the train had a mind of its own, like it was fighting him, resisting him. And then he saw them. Reflections in the glass of the control room door, dozens of shadowy figures standing in the carriage behind him, their faces obscured, their forms flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. They didn't move, just stared at him with hollow eyes, eyes that were both there and not there, eyes that saw through him, into him, like they knew every sin, every secret he'd ever buried. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen, trapped in that chair as the train hurtled forward. The whispering grew louder, filling his head, making it hard to think, to breathe. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping they'd be gone when he opened them, but when he did, they were closer, their distorted faces pressing against the glass, mouths moving in silent curses. And then the train began to slow down, not because Sam wanted it to, but because it had to. The engine sputtered, the brakes engaged on their own, and the train rolled to a stop. Sam looked up, heart hammering in his chest, and saw where they were. Another station, one that wasn't on any map he'd ever seen, a place that shouldn't exist. The platform was old, crumbling, overgrown with weeds and moss, and standing on it were more of them, shadows in human form, waiting. The doors opened, but Sam didn't touch the controls. They just opened, inviting whatever was out there to come in. The shadows boarded one by one, filling the train until there was no space left, until Sam could barely breathe under the weight of their presence. They didn't sit, didn't speak, just stared at him with those empty eyes. And then, without warning, the train started moving again. Faster this time, too fast, like it was trying to outrun something. But Sam knew deep down that there was no escape. He was trapped with them, with these things that weren't alive but weren't dead either, things that had been waiting for him all along. He tried to stop the train, but the controls wouldn't respond. He tried to call for help, but the radio was dead, just static and more of that infernal whispering. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but the shadows and the cold, suffocating darkness. The train raced through the night, faster and faster, the world outside a blur of black and grey. Sam could feel them closing in, could feel their cold breath on the back of his neck, their fingers brushing against his skin. He could hear their voices clearer now, and he finally understood what they were saying. They were calling his name. Sam looked up, and there in the rearview mirror he saw his own reflection. But it wasn't him. It was a twisted, distorted version of himself, eyes hollow and dead, skin pale and stretched tight over bone. The reflection smiled, a grotesque, mocking grin, and Sam realized with dawning horror that it wasn't a reflection at all. It was a glimpse of what he was becoming. The train plunged into a tunnel, the darkness swallowing everything. The whispering stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against his ears, his chest, his mind. And in that silence, Sam knew the truth. He was never leaving this train. He was a part of it now, just like the others. A ghost in a machine that wasn't supposed to exist, bound to the rails, forever moving, forever trapped. The train emerged from the tunnel into the dawn, but Sam didn't see it. He was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked like him but wasn't. The train slowed as it approached a station, another forgotten stop in another forgotten place. The doors opened, and a new passenger boarded, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And as the train pulled away, leaving the station behind, a whisper echoed through the empty carriage, a whisper that carried on the wind, through the tracks, into the night. Welcome to the District 66, and the train kept going forever and ever, carrying the lost, the damned, and those who thought they could escape. But no one ever does. Not from the District 66, not from the shadows, not from what waits in the dark. Annalisa Michel. A name whispered in hushed tones, a name synonymous with horror. She was a young girl from Germany, a devout Catholic. Her life, once filled with promise, took a sinister turn at the tender age of 16. Annalisa began experiencing strange occurrences. Visions plagued her, voices whispered in her ear, tormenting her with unholy pronouncements. Doctors, baffled by her condition, offered a clinical diagnosis: epilepsy. Medication was prescribed, but it provided no solace. Annalisa knew deep in her soul that this was no ordinary ailment. This is the story of Annalisa Michel. At first, the voices were faint, a mere whisper at the edge of hearing. Annalisa would brush them off, attributing them to an overactive imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent with each passing day. They taunted her, mocked her faith, and filled her dreams with unspeakable horrors. The visions began subtly as well, fleeting shadows that danced at the periphery of her vision. But soon the shadows took on more sinister forms. Grotesque faces with eyes that burned like hot coals leered at her from the darkness. Annalisa, a devout Catholic, clung to her faith, seeking solace in prayer. She could feel a presence within her, a darkness that was slowly consuming her soul. The seizures began suddenly, racking her young body with violent convulsions. Doctors diagnosed her with epilepsy. Annalisa was prescribed a cocktail of drugs, each one designed to quell the seizures. But the pills brought no relief. The seizures continued, each one seemingly more violent than the last. And worse, the voices, the visions, they remained, undeterred by the pharmaceuticals meant to banish them. Her parents, though devout in their faith, were torn. They clung to the hope that the doctors were right. But as the weeks turned into months and Annaliese's condition worsened, doubt began to creep into their hearts. Anneliese herself never doubted the nature of her affliction. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was possessed. Annaliese's once vibrant life, filled with the simple joys of youth, was now consumed by darkness. She withdrew from her friends, her laughter silenced by the constant torment that raged within her. Her grades, once exemplary, plummeted as she struggled to focus on anything but the chilling reality of her possession. Her family, once a beacon of warmth and love, was slowly being torn apart by the strain of her condition. Annaliese's once peaceful bedroom became a battleground. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and images of saints, now bore the marks of her desperate struggle. Annaliese's world, once filled with the promise of a bright future, had been plunged into a terrifying abyss. With medical science failing to provide any relief, Annaliese's parents turned to their last resort, the Catholic Church. They believed, with unwavering conviction, that their daughter was in the clutches of something evil, something beyond the realm of human understanding. They reached out to their local priest, a kind and gentle man who had known Anneliese since she was a child. But even he, a man of God, was hesitant to believe their claims of demonic possession. Finally, after months of searching, they found two priests, Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz, who were willing to listen without judgment. Father Alt, a man of stern demeanor and unwavering faith, had a reputation for his knowledge of ancient rituals and his unflinching resolve in the face of evil. Father Renz, younger and more compassionate, possessed a deep understanding of human suffering and an unshakable belief in the power of prayer. Together they formed a formidable duo, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. They understood the gravity of the task before them, the very real danger posed by the entities they were about to confront. The bishop finally granted his approval, though not without reservations. The first exorcism took place in a small room, the air thick with incense and anticipation. Annalise, her once vibrant eyes now hollowed by suffering, sat rigidly on a chair, her body restrained by leather straps. Father Alt, his voice booming with authority, began the ancient rite. He invoked the name of God, demanding the demons to identify themselves, to release their hold on the young woman's soul. At first, there was silence. Then, a low growl emanated from Annalise, growing steadily louder, more menacing. The battle had begun. The demons, angered by the priest's intrusion, unleashed their fury upon the room. Objects flew across the room with impossible force, smashing against the walls. Annalise writhed in agony, her screams echoing the torment that raged within her. Father Alt, his voice unwavering, continued to recite the ancient rites. Father Renz sprinkled holy water on Annalise, the blessed liquid sizzling like acid upon contact with her skin. The first encounter had only served to reveal the true nature of the enemy they faced. Ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. The exorcisms continued week after week, each session a brutal confrontation between the forces of light and darkness. Annalise's condition, far from improving, deteriorated at an alarming rate. Her body, once healthy and vibrant, was now a ravaged battleground. She refused food, claiming the demons wouldn't allow her to eat. Her once healthy frame wasted away, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones. The demons, it seemed, were relentless in their torment, determined to break her body and spirit. Annaliese's once peaceful bedroom became a prison, a place of fear and suffering. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and religious icons, were now bare, stripped clean by her own hand in a desperate attempt to silence the voices that taunted her from every corner. She saw things, horrible things, lurking in the shadows. Demons, their eyes glowing with malevolent glee, leered at her from the darkness. The air in the room was heavy with the stench of sulfur, a constant reminder of the demonic presence that had invaded her sanctuary. Her faith, once unshakable, was being tested to its very core. As the exorcisms continued, Annaliese's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would lapse into periods of lucidity, her voice regaining its former sweetness, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking vulnerability. She spoke of her torment, of the constant battle raging within her soul. She begged for forgiveness, for release from the nightmare that had engulfed her. But these moments of clarity were fleeting, soon replaced by renewed onslaughts of demonic rage. Those who witnessed these transformations were left shaken to their core, their faith tested by the sheer intensity of the evil they witnessed. Throughout this ordeal, Annaliese's parents remained steadfast in their belief that their daughter was possessed, that only through exorcism could she be freed from the grip of the entities that tormented her. Anna Michel, Annaliese's mother, bore the brunt of her daughter's suffering. She cared for her tirelessly, comforting her during her moments of lucidity and praying by her bedside late into the night. She witnessed firsthand the toll the exorcisms were taking on her daughter's body and mind. Anna's love for her daughter was unwavering, a testament to the enduring power of the maternal bond. By the spring of 1976, a palpable sense of dread had settled over the Michel household. Annaliese, her body ravaged by months of relentless torment, was but a shadow of her former self. The once vibrant young woman was now skeletal, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones, her eyes hollowed out by suffering. The exorcisms, once a beacon of hope, had become a gruesome spectacle. Father Alt and Father Renz, their faces etched with fatigue and a growing sense of despair, continued their grim duty. The demons boasted of their power, their intention to claim Annaliese's soul for their own, to drag her down into the abyss. Section 2. The Price of Faith. Annaliese's parents, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion, clung to their faith as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. They believed with unwavering conviction that their daughter's suffering was a test from God, a trial by fire that she had to endure in order to find salvation. They refused to consider medical intervention, believing it would only serve to anger the demons, to prolong Annaliese's torment. They placed their trust in the Church, in the power of the exorcisms to drive out the evil that had taken root in their daughter's soul. But as Annaliese's condition worsened, their resolve began to waver. The weight of their decision, the knowledge that they were responsible for their daughter's well-being, pressed down on them with crushing force. They questioned their faith, their judgment, their sanity. Was this truly the will of God? Or had they, in their desperation, condemned their daughter to a slow and agonizing death? The guilt gnawed at their consciences, a heavy burden they carried alongside their grief. Section 3. A Life Extinguished. On the 1st of July 1976, Annaliese Michel drew her last breath. Her tortured body, finally succumbing to the relentless assault, found peace in death. The silence that descended upon the Michel household was deafening, a stark contrast to the screams and prayers that had filled the air for months. Annalise's parents, their faces etched with grief and a profound sense of loss, knelt beside her bed, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Their daughter, their little girl, was gone, taken from them by a force they couldn't comprehend, couldn't control. Father Alt and Father Wren stood by, their heads bowed, their faces pale with shock and exhaustion. They had fought valiantly, had poured all their faith and energy into saving Annalise's soul. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The demons, it seemed, had claimed their prize. Or had they? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Annalise's death, a tragedy by any measure, left behind a void, a chilling testament to the power of belief, the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most devout faith. The news of Annalise Michel's death sent shockwaves through the small German town, reaching a global audience hungry for sensationalism. The story, a chilling blend of faith, superstition, and tragedy, captured the imagination, sparking heated debates about the nature of good and evil. The authorities launched an investigation. Father Alt, Father Renz, and Annalise's parents were charged with negligent homicide, accused of prioritizing their beliefs over her well-being. The trial captivated the world, revealing disturbing details. In the end, they were found guilty of manslaughter. They were sentenced to probation and suspended jail terms. The question lingered: what had truly killed Annalise Michel? The quaint cemetery on the outskirts of Klingenberg, Germany, holds a dark secret. Amongst the weathered headstones and moss-covered angels lies a grave that draws the curious and the devout alike. It is the final resting place of Annalise Michel, a name whispered in hushed tones. Her grave has become a pilgrimage site, adorned with rosaries, flowers, and handwritten pleas. They leave behind tokens of their devotion, their whispered prayers a testament to belief. Annalise's story, like all good ghost stories, is shrouded in ambiguity. Was she truly possessed, or a victim of misdiagnosed mental illness? The debate rages on, fueled by conflicting narratives of faith and reason. Believers point to documented evidence, skeptics to the lack of concrete proof. Annalise's story forces us to confront our beliefs and question what we hold to be true. The story of Annalise Michel is a haunting one. It chills you to the bone, making you question the nature of good and evil. Was Annalise possessed by demons or a victim of her troubled mind? There are no easy answers, no neat resolutions to this tale. The human mind is complex and often terrifying, capable of great love and compassion, but also unimaginable darkness. We seek answers, clinging to beliefs in a chaotic world. Annalise's story reminds us of the power of belief. It forces us to confront our own vulnerability. Sarah was a force of nature, a whirlwind of curiosity and nerve. Most folks thought she was too brave or maybe just plain crazy. But Sarah, she didn't care much for whispers or warnings. She craved the unknown, the unexplained. See, Sarah was a final-year med student, a brain box they called her, but her curiosity, it went beyond textbooks and dissections. She had a soft spot for the strange, the eerie, the downright spooky. One late night, hunched over anatomy books with a classmate, Sarah stumbled upon it. A legend whispered in hushed tones, a place most folks avoided like the plague. "The Red Cemetery," her classmate muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes lit up. This, she thought, this is what I've been waiting for. The Red Cemetery wasn't your typical graveyard. No, sir, this one had a reputation, a nasty one. Locals would tell you the soil ran red from the blood of souls trapped within its gates. Whispers and tales followed the cemetery like a shroud. Stories passed down through generations, tales of cold spots, disembodied voices, and shadows that moved with a life of their own. Some folks claimed the cemetery was built on cursed land, a place where ancient, unholy rituals had stained the earth. They said the spirits of those who died there, they never truly left. Friday night rolled around. While others hit the bars and clubs, Sarah, she had other plans. She grabbed her flashlight, pulled on her jacket. Tonight she was going on an adventure. The air grew colder as she neared the cemetery gates. A shiver ran down her spine. Don't be ridiculous, she thought. It's just an old graveyard. But there was no denying the feeling. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. With a groan, the rusty gates swung open. It was as if the cemetery itself was welcoming her, or maybe warning her. Sarah stepped inside. The ground crunched under her feet. That blood-red dirt, it was like nothing she'd ever seen. It felt wrong, unnatural. She shone her flashlight around. Rows of tombstones stretched out before her. A sea of stone, cold and silent. The air grew colder. A chill ran down her spine. She shook it off. Don't be silly, she told herself. It's just the wind. But deep down, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She walked deeper into the cemetery. The tombstones were old, many cracked and covered in moss. Names and dates, worn away by time, were barely visible. Each step felt heavier than the last. The silence pressed in on her. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt expectant, like something was waiting. She stopped at a particularly large tombstone. The inscription was completely gone, but as she reached out to touch it, she felt it, a faint vibration. It thrummed beneath her fingers, a low hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2. The Whispering Dead. Sarah pulled her hand back as if burned. She shone her light around, but there was nothing. Just the tombstones, silent and still. She listened. The silence was broken now by a low, mournful whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wind picked up, swirling around her. The whispers grew louder. Words, fragments of sentences carried on the breeze. She couldn't make them out, but the sound sent shivers down her spine. It was the sound of sorrow, of anger, of something ancient and deeply unsettling. She thought she saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. She swung her flashlight around, but it was gone. Just her imagination, she thought, trying to calm her racing heart. But the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. A twig snapped. She whirled around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the wind whistling through the trees and those whispers, those damned whispers growing louder, closer. She had to get out of there. Section 3. The Ancient Mausoleum. She turned to leave, but her flashlight beam fell on something else. Hidden amongst the trees, almost completely obscured by shadows, was a mausoleum. It was old. Far older than any of the surrounding graves. The stone was cracked and weathered, and the iron gate hung precariously from its hinges. She should leave. She knew it, but something drew her towards the mausoleum, a morbid curiosity perhaps, or maybe something else, something she couldn't quite name. She took a deep breath and walked towards it. The gate creaked open with a groan that echoed through the cemetery, a sound that seemed to claw at the silence. She shone her flashlight inside. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre decorations. In the center of the mausoleum stood a single stone sarcophagus. It was ornately carved, depicting scenes of death and mourning. The lid of the sarcophagus was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to open it or something. Section 1. A voice from the stone. The air inside the mausoleum felt different, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand on end. She took a hesitant step closer, drawn to the sarcophagus like a moth to a flame. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It seemed to emanate from the sarcophagus itself, a low, mournful sigh. Sarah. The voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was a woman's voice, weak and raspy, as if from beyond the grave. She knew she should run, get out of there while she still could, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She shone her flashlight on the sarcophagus, her hand trembling. The stone was cold to the touch, and she could feel that faint vibration again, that hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2. The Apparition. Sarah. The voice whispered again, closer now, stronger. The air around her grew colder, and a strange mist began to rise from the opening in the sarcophagus. The mist swirled and coalesced, taking on a vaguely human form. Sarah watched in horror as the figure solidified. It was a woman, or at least the ghostly remnants of one. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow sockets burning with an eerie internal light. The woman reached out a hand, her touch icy cold as it brushed against Sarah's arm. Sarah gasped, a scream catching in her throat. The woman's touch sent a jolt of fear through her, a primal terror she had never known. "Leave this place," the ghost hissed, her voice a raspy whisper. "Leave now while you still can." Section 3. Fleeing the Dead. The ghost's touch snapped Sarah out of her trance. Adrenaline surged through her and she turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. She could hear the ghost's voice behind her echoing through the mausoleum. "You should not have come here," the voice wailed. "You have disturbed the dead." Sarah didn't dare look back. She scrambled out of the mausoleum, her heart pounding in her chest. The rusty gate swung shut behind her with a clang, as if sealing her fate. She sprinted through the cemetery, her lungs burning, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. The whispers were back, louder than before, swirling around her, taunting her. She could feel the ghost's presence behind her, cold and menacing. She didn't slow down, not even when she reached the cemetery gates. She threw herself at them, her shoulder slamming against the rusted metal. The gates creaked open, and she stumbled out onto the road, falling to her knees in the dirt. Section 4. The Haunting Begins. Sarah didn't slow down until she reached the sanctuary of her apartment. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it, bolting it, as if that would keep out the horrors she had witnessed. She tried to tell herself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But deep down she knew the truth. She had seen something real in that mausoleum, something that defied explanation, something that chilled her to the core. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her, filled with images of the ghostly woman, her hollow eyes burning into Sarah's very soul. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin still lingering. During the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of her vision. Whispers followed her, faint and indistinct, but undeniably present. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. She couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her home from that cemetery. Days turned into weeks, but the haunting continued. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open and slammed shut, and the temperature in her apartment plummeted without reason. She tried to confide in her friends, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? They would think she was crazy, and maybe she was. But that didn't make the fear any less real. One night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard it. The voice, clear as day, whispering her name from the darkness. Sarah. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She could feel a presence in the room with her, cold and menacing. Her eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows, but she could see nothing. Sarah, we are here. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They swirled around her, wrapping around her like icy fingers, dragging her down into the darkness. She was trapped, her worst nightmare come true. The spirits of the red cemetery had followed her home. The light began to fade from Sarah's life. Sunlight, once so warm and inviting, now felt harsh and intrusive. She withdrew into herself, a prisoner in her own home. The whispers followed her everywhere. They taunted her, mocked her, reminded her of the darkness that clung to her. Sleep, once an escape, became a terrifying ordeal. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum haunted her dreams, her hollow eyes boring into Sarah's soul. Her studies, once her passion, now seemed trivial, meaningless. How could she focus on anatomy and physiology when her own world was unraveling? Her grades plummeted. Her friends, worried, tried to reach out, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance, lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace, every creak of the floorboard a whispered threat. The walls of her apartment, once a source of comfort and security, were closing in, suffocating her. Doubt gnawed at her sanity. Was she going mad? Was this all in her head? Her medical training told her that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a logical explanation for what she was experiencing. She tried to convince herself that she was just stressed, overworked, that her mind was playing tricks on her. She tried to rationalize the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin, but deep down, a primal fear told her otherwise. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at her. Her skin was pale, her hair dull and lifeless. The spark of curiosity that had once burned so brightly in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull flicker of fear. She was losing herself, consumed by the darkness that had seeped into her life from that cursed cemetery. The thought terrified her, but it was a terrifying thought, mixed with a strange sense of inevitability. One night, the haunting took a sinister turn. She lay in bed, her body exhausted, her mind racing. Sleep wouldn't come, not tonight, not with the feeling of dread that hung so heavily in the air. The room grew cold, the temperature plummeting as if a window had been thrown open. But there was no breeze, no sound of wind or rain, just a deathly stillness that pressed down on her, suffocating her. Then she saw it. At the foot of her bed, a shadow coalesced from the darkness. It swirled and twisted, taking on the shape of the ghostly woman from the mausoleum. Her eyes, hollow black pits, burned into Sarah's soul. Terror, raw and primal, surged through her. She tried to scream, to move, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by an unseen force. The ghostly woman glided closer, her movements fluid, effortless, as if she were a creature of smoke and shadow. "You are mine now," the ghost whispered, her voice a chilling rasp that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "You belong to the Red Cemetery." The ghostly hand touched Sarah's forehead and a jolt of icy fire surged through her body. She screamed, a sound that died in her throat, unheard, unheeded. Her vision blurred, the room spinning wildly. Then darkness swallowed her whole. When Sarah awoke, she found herself lying on the cold, damp ground. Disoriented, she sat up and looked around. Tombstones, ancient and weathered, surrounded her. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the sound of mournful whispers carried on the wind. She was back in the Red Cemetery, trapped in a labyrinth of the dead. And this time she knew there would be no escape. The spirits had claimed her, body and soul. She was lost to the world, a prisoner of the Red Cemetery, forever bound to the restless dead. Sarah, the girl who once embraced life with open arms, was gone, vanished. The spark in her eyes, the one that had always burned so brightly, was extinguished, replaced by a dull, haunting emptiness. The world, once a place of wonder and excitement, had become a dim, shadowy reflection of its former self. She was a ghost in her own life, a spectre haunting the halls of her apartment, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her once bright smile, now a distant memory, rarely graced her lips. The joy that had once radiated from her, drawing people in with its warmth, had been replaced by an icy chill that pushed them away. The world outside continued to spin, oblivious to the torment that raged within her. The sun rose and set, oblivious to the darkness that had enveloped her soul. The laughter of children playing in the street was a distant echo, a painful reminder of a life she could no longer remember. She was adrift in a sea of shadows, the once familiar landmarks of her life swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Her dreams, once filled with aspirations and ambitions, had become nightmares, haunted by the ghostly woman and the oppressive presence of the Red Cemetery. Her textbooks lay open on the table, the pages filled with intricate diagrams of the human body, a subject that had once fascinated her. Now the words seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, their meaning lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She was a stranger in a familiar land, her own body a foreign entity. The scalpel, once an instrument of precision and knowledge, now felt cold and heavy in her hand, a symbol of the life she had once aspired to. Her reflection in the mirror was a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root within her. Her skin, once radiant with life, was now ashen and pale, stretched taut over her cheekbones. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence and curiosity, were now dull and lifeless, two dark pools reflecting the emptiness that consumed her soul. She was a shell of her former self, a hollowed-out vessel haunted by the spirits of the Red Cemetery. The girl who had once dared to explore the unknown had become a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in a labyrinth of her own making. The Red Cemetery held her captive, its grip on her soul tightening with each passing day. She could feel its presence everywhere, a suffocating weight on her chest, a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed her. The whispers followed her, taunting her with fragments of memories distorted and laced with a chilling malice. They whispered of her failure, of her weakness, of her inevitable surrender to the darkness. She dreamed of the cemetery, its twisted trees and crumbling tombstones a constant backdrop to her nightmares. In her dreams, she wandered aimlessly through its overgrown paths, her footsteps echoing in the silence, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The cemetery had become her prison, its walls closing in on her, suffocating her with its oppressive presence. She was bound to it, tethered to its darkness by an invisible chain forged in fear and despair. The world outside faded to a distant hum, its vibrant colors and chaotic symphony replaced by the cold, silent embrace of the Red Cemetery, the warmth of the sun, the gentle caress of the breeze, the sounds of life and laughter. All were lost to her, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. She was no longer Sarah, the curious girl who had dared to tempt fate. She was nothing more than a vessel, a hollow shell inhabited by the restless spirits of the Red Cemetery. Their whispers filled her mind, their will her own. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum, her face a mask of both triumph and sorrow, stood over Sarah's lifeless form. Her work was done. The Red Cemetery had claimed another soul, adding another name to its ever-growing list of victims. The shadows stretched and danced, their forms shifting and swirling in the twilight. The Red Cemetery, its thirst for life momentarily sated, settled back into an uneasy silence, its secrets buried deep beneath the blood-red earth, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path. Emily's fingers gripped the steering wheel as she drove down the narrow, winding road cutting through the dense, unforgiving forest of rural Scotland. The moon was nothing more than a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the world around her. The tall pines loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows long and twisted, stretching out onto the road like bony fingers reaching for something or someone. The radio crackled with static, and Emily reached over to turn it off, shuddering at the sudden silence that filled the car. She was miles from the nearest town, and the idea of being alone in the middle of nowhere had started to gnaw at her nerves. But she was almost there, almost at the cabin her friend had told her about, a supposed retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. A dark figure darted out onto the road ahead. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the gravel. She strained her eyes to see what it was, but the shadows seemed to swallow it whole. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stared into the abyss before her, and then nothing, no movement, no sound. With trembling hands, she tried to restart the car, but the engine only groaned in protest. She tried again, nothing. The headlights flickered, and then, with a disheartening click, they went out completely, plunging her into darkness. "Shit," she muttered under her breath, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. She reached for her phone, but of course there was no signal. There never was when you really needed it. As she sat there, the darkness seemed to press in on her, thick and suffocating. Then she heard it, a faint rustling sound like leaves being disturbed. Emily froze, her ears straining to catch any other noises. A soft giggle floated through the night, high-pitched and unnatural. Her blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line just beyond the road. There, amidst the trees, she could see them. Shadows flitting between the trunks, too quick to make out, but there. Watching. Waiting. No, she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the rising panic. It's just the wind, just my imagination. But the sound of laughter, a chorus of it now, mingling with whispers, grew louder, closer. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, its metal cold against her skin, and opened the car door with a creak that echoed through the night. Stepping out, the air was cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She pointed the flashlight toward the trees, the beam slicing through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Just the endless rows of trees standing tall and still. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky, barely a whisper. But she didn't want an answer. Not really. She took a step forward, then another, the gravel crunching under her boots. The whispers seemed to beckon her, drawing her into the forest. And despite every instinct screaming at her to stay by the car, she moved toward the tree line, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows as she ventured deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around her, the canopy above blocking out what little moonlight there was. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that made her skin prickle with unease. She stopped, realizing she was now surrounded by the forest, the road and her car lost somewhere behind her. She turned in a slow circle, the beam of her flashlight darting from tree to tree, searching for anything, anyone. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. A twig snapped behind her and she spun around, the flashlight illuminating a figure standing just at the edge of the beam's reach. It was the silhouette of a person, unmoving, watching her with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Stay away!" she shouted, taking a step back, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there like a statue carved out of the night itself. The light flickered again, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned wildly, the light now revealing several figures around her, all with the same glowing eyes, their faces obscured by shadow. She screamed and broke into a run, her feet slipping on the damp leaves as she crashed through the underbrush. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, casting monstrous shadows as she sprinted blindly through the trees. The whispers had returned, louder now, as if they were right beside her, inside her head. Suddenly the ground disappeared beneath her feet. She tumbled down a steep embankment, her body slamming into the earth, rocks tearing at her clothes and skin. The flashlight flew from her hand and shattered against a tree trunk, plunging her into complete darkness. Emily lay there gasping for breath, her body throbbing with pain. She could hear them moving closer, the whispers now a cacophony surrounding her. With a final, desperate burst of energy, she pushed herself to her feet, but it was too late. The figures were there, just beyond the edge of her vision, closing in. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off as a cold hand wrapped around her throat, pulling her down into the darkness. The last thing Emily heard was the sound of laughter echoing through the trees as everything faded to black.
Adam thrived in the darkness. 14 years he had spent working the graveyard shift in museums, surrounded by echoes of the past. He knew the rhythm of the night, the way shadows danced in the moonlight. Each night was a journey through history, a solitary exploration of forgotten stories. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for this. The museum was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and towering exhibits. Adam patrolled the halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He paused at the entrance to the Egyptian exhibit, a shiver crawling down his spine. The hieroglyphs lining the sarcophagi seemed to writhe and shift, their ancient power palpable. He moved on, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the feeling of unease persisted, clinging to him like cobwebs. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. It was as if the very walls were listening, waiting for him to let down his guard. Something about this museum chipped away at his certainty, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. Two weeks of unsettling quiet, fleeting shadows, and a growing sense of dread. He'd been hired for his experience, but nothing had prepared him for this. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a whisper that vanished quickly. As the days turned into nights, the incidents became more frequent. The shadows grew bolder, lingering in doorways, darting behind pillars. The whispers morphed into distinct sounds, a soft sigh, a muffled laugh, footsteps echoing through empty corridors. He started to feel a presence, unseen but palpable, following him. Adam had always dismissed supernatural tales as folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. It began simply, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Easy to dismiss as fatigue, but Adam knew the difference. There was a rhythm to the night, a predictable dance of light and shadow. This was something else. He found himself pausing more often, his gaze sweeping across the darkened exhibits. The feeling lingered, a prickle on the back of his neck, the unsettling sensation of being watched. The silence seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. He chided himself for acting like a rookie. This was just a job, a paycheck. The flicker persisted, growing bolder each night. It began to intrude, a fleeting darkness darting across the walls. At first Adam tried to ignore it, telling himself it was a moth, a bat, but deep down a primal fear took root. One night he swore he saw it again, a shadow slipping behind a statue. He froze, his heart pounding, but found nothing. He forced a laugh, a nervous expulsion of air that did little to ease the tension. By the fifth night, the flicker had morphed into a full-fledged shadow. Adam, his nerves frayed, decided to confront it. Near the medieval armory he saw it, a tall, indistinct shape lurking in the shadows. "All right, that's enough," he muttered, stepping closer. "I don't know what you are, but this game is over." The shadow didn't move, remaining perfectly still. Adam, his heart hammering, took another step, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dust motes. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He was alone. Or was he? The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the hairs on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the armory. Empty suits of armor stared back at him. He could have sworn he felt a breath on his neck, cold and fetid. His pulse quickened. He needed to get a grip. Adam found himself drawn to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the oldest, most unsettling part of the museum. He hated the way the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. And most of all, he hated the obsidian amulet. Carved from a single piece of obsidian, it depicted a scarab beetle. But it was the energy emanating from the amulet that unsettled Adam. It was as if the amulet held a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that watched and waited. Tonight, Adam had come prepared with his trusty flask of whiskey. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. He took a long swig, feeling his anxiety lessen. "All right, you ancient relic," he muttered, staring down at the obsidian amulet. He spent hours pacing around the Egyptian exhibit, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by his own breathing. He was starting to think he was wasting his time, When he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible above his heartbeat. He froze, his flashlight beam wavering. He strained his ears, listening for any repetition of the sound. Silence. He was about to dismiss it when he heard it again, a whisper, soft and sibilant. It was a language he didn't recognize, sending chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight around the exhibit, but there was nothing there. And then, the lights flickered, and the museum was plunged into darkness. "Shit," Adam cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him. He had to get out of there. Panic swelled in Adam's chest. The whispers intensified, morphing into a low, guttural chant. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their malevolent intent. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. His breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to run. He remembered the layout of the museum, the emergency exits. But fear drove him deeper into the darkness. He stumbled over something hard and metallic. He shone his flashlight down, realizing he was beside the empty pedestal where the amulet had been displayed. The case was empty. The obsidian amulet was gone. It wasn't just an object, it was something alive, something malevolent. He needed to get out, to call for help. But the whispers, now a cacophony of sound, seemed to press in on him, urging him forward, deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum. He was no longer in control of his own actions, his body moving on instinct, driven by a fear so profound it bordered on madness. He stumbled through the darkness, his flashlight beam a beacon of futility in the overwhelming blackness. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and decay, a suffocating miasma that seemed to cling to his lungs, stealing his breath. He could feel the whispers closing in around him, pressing against his skin like icy fingers, their voices growing louder, more insistent. The chanting had become a chorus, a symphony of shadows and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was trapped, hunted by something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. His flashlight beam darted frantically across the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty hallways and the occasional glint of glass from a display case. He was lost, disoriented, his senses overloaded by the oppressive darkness, the suffocating air, the relentless chanting that seemed to be closing in on him like a tightening noose. And then, through the darkness and the fear, he saw it. A faint light flickering like a candle flame at the end of the corridor. Hope surged through him, a lifeline in the sea of darkness. He stumbled towards it, his pace quickening, his fear momentarily forgotten in the desperate need to escape. As he drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a doorway, an archway leading into another part of the museum. He didn't recognize this section, but it didn't matter. All he cared about was getting out of the darkness, away from the whispers that seemed to be clawing at his sanity. He was almost to the doorway when the light flickered once and died, plunging him back into absolute darkness. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he stumbled to a halt, his hand flying out to brace himself against the wall. And that's when he saw it. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light filtering in from the hallway beyond, was a figure. Tall, skeletal, its form shrouded in what appeared to be tattered robes. 2 points of light burned within the depths of its hood, like embers in the darkness. Adam froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The chanting stopped. An unnerving silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was as if time itself had ground to a halt, every detail of that moment etched into his memory with terrifying clarity. The figure's stillness, the way it seemed to absorb the surrounding light, the 2 burning embers that locked onto his gaze with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. He couldn't tell how long they stood there, locked in that silent confrontation. It felt like an eternity, a timeless void where fear was the only constant. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had appeared, the figure began to move towards him. 1 step, 2. Each movement was agonizingly slow, measured, as if the figure was savoring Adam's terror, drawing it out, prolonging the moment. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger, until it felt like a physical presence, suffocating him, pressing down on him. Just as the figure was a step away, A hair's breadth from reaching him, the lights flickered back on. The sudden illumination was blinding. Adam blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to adjust. He looked back to the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was gone. The sudden return of light was like a physical blow. Adam reeled, his eyes stinging, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway stretched before him, empty, illuminated by the harsh glare of the emergency lights. The chanting had ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pregnant with unseen menace. He didn't hesitate, didn't waste a single second trying to rationalize what he'd seen. His body, fueled by adrenaline and raw terror, took over. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor, the sound bouncing off the walls like the frantic beat of a drum. He didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following him. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for respite, but still he ran. The museum, once a place of wonder and intrigue, had transformed into a nightmare, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that he was desperate to escape. He careened around corners, his flashlight beam a jittery beacon in the darkness, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and adrenaline. The emergency exit seemed miles away, each corridor stretching endlessly before him, twisting and turning in a disorienting dance of shadows and light. The night air hit him like a slap, cold, crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something ancient and unsettling that clung to the back of his throat like bile. He stumbled out of the museum, his chest heaving, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't stop running until he reached the street, the harsh glare of the streetlights momentarily blinding him. The city, usually a symphony of noise and light, seemed strangely muted, as if holding its breath, observing him from a distance. He glanced back at the museum, its imposing facade looming over the street, its windows dark and lifeless. From this distance it seemed almost peaceful, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. But Adam knew better. He had looked into the heart of that silence, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and malevolent. He stood there for a long moment, catching his breath, trying to slow the frantic beating of his heart. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a terrifying montage of shadows, whispers, and that final, chilling encounter in the darkened doorway. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He needed to call someone, tell someone what had happened, but who would believe him? Who would understand? He was just a night watchman, a nobody paid to sit in the dark and pretend to guard against the impossible. He looked back at the museum, a shiver running down his spine. He could almost feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating, as if daring him to return, to test its boundaries once more. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never be free of this place, that it had sunk its claws into him, marked him as its own. He thought about the amulet, the obsidian scarab beetle with its outstretched wings. Was it merely an object, a conduit for some unseen force? Or was it something more, something alive, something malevolent that had chosen him, singled him out for its own twisted purposes? He didn't know the answers, and for the first time in his life he didn't want to know. Some things, he realized, were best left buried in the darkness, locked away in the silent tombs of history. Adam turned and walked away from the museum, his steps slow at first, hesitant then gradually gaining purpose. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never set foot inside that building again. He had looked into the abyss, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and evil, and it had changed him. He was no longer the man he had been, the skeptic who dismissed the whispers of the night as mere superstition. He had seen the truth, had felt its touch, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. As he walked, he could feel the city watching him, its lights seeming to flicker and dim as he passed. He was a stranger in a familiar land, marked by his encounter with the darkness, forever changed by the whispers that echoed in the silence of his mind. The museum stood silent, its secrets locked away once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, expectant. It was a silence filled with the knowledge of what had transpired, of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting, watching, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold and awaken the darkness within.
Midnight Ritual. There are things you don't mess with. Not in Ireland, not anywhere, especially not in the woods around midnight. But Finn and his mates weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. That's what made them perfect for what happened. It started as a stupid dare, really. A few pints down at O'Malley's, and someone, probably that idiot Sean, brought up the old tales of Dunry Woods. How back in 1866 the townsfolk burned witches there, sacrificing them to some demon god whose name was lost to time. Apparently, those witches cursed the land with their dying breaths, swearing revenge on anyone who dared disturb their rest. You know, the usual bedtime story stuff that parents tell their kids to keep them out of trouble. But Finn, Sean, Ryan, and Mick were all about trouble. They laughed off the warnings from old men at the pub, the ones who stared into their pints with hollow eyes, muttering about the midnight ritual. It was all bollocks to them, just another ghost story to scare off the tourists. So naturally, they decided to go and see for themselves. Midnight, they said. They'd go at midnight because that's when the witches were burned, right? Something about the veil between worlds being thinnest at that hour. Finn didn't really care about the details. He just wanted to see if there was anything to those old stories. They drove out to Dunry Woods in Sean's beat-up car, the moon full and bright, illuminating their path through the winding country roads. The air was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. When they reached the edge of the woods, they stumbled out of the car, laughing, pushing each other like the idiots they were. "Come on, you bunch of wankers. Let's see some witches," Sean yelled, grinning like the fool he was. He held up a torch and waved it around, the light casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. No wind rustling the leaves, no animals scurrying about, just silence. It was the kind of silence that presses on your chest, makes it hard to breathe. Finn felt it, but he ignored it. Didn't want to seem like a coward in front of the lads. They ventured deeper into the woods, their voices loud and obnoxious in the still night. Finn kept glancing around, feeling like the shadows were watching them, but every time he looked, there was nothing. Just trees and more trees. They reached a clearing, the supposed site of the burnings. The ground was barren, the trees around it twisted and blackened, like they had been scorched by something unnatural. It was colder here too, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there. The air smelled wrong, like burnt hair and rotten meat. But still, the lads were too thick-headed to notice. "All right, let's get this ritual started, yeah?" Sean laughed, pulling out a lighter and a cigarette. He sparked the flame, and that's when everything changed. The wind picked up out of nowhere, howling through the trees like a chorus of the damned. The fire in Sean's hand flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Finn's heart pounded in his chest, and he could see the others tense up too. "Who's fucking around?" Mick muttered, looking over his shoulder. But there was no one there. Just them. But they weren't alone. Finn could feel it. Something was watching them. Something old, something angry. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The shadows around them seemed to shift and twist, moving closer, tightening their circle. "Fuck this," Ryan whispered, but it was too late. The ritual had already begun. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human, their faces twisted with rage and pain, the witches. Their eyes burned with hatred, their mouths opening in silent screams as they reached out with clawed hands. Sean was the first to go. One of the figures lunged at him, its fingers digging into his flesh, tearing him apart with a strength no human should have. He didn't even have time to scream. The others watched, frozen in horror, as Sean's body was ripped to shreds, his blood soaking into the cursed earth. "Run!" Finn yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the wind, by the screams of the damned. He turned to flee, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in on them, pulling them down into the cold, unforgiving ground. Mick was next. One of the witches latched onto him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the trees, but Finn knew no one would hear them, no one would come to save them. Ryan tried to fight, swinging his fists wildly, but it was useless. The witches were relentless, their vengeance unstoppable. They tore him apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a pool of blood and broken bones. Finn was the last one standing. He could feel the cold hands of the witches closing in on him, feel their breath on the back of his neck. He fell to his knees, knowing there was no escape, no salvation. The earth opened up beneath him, and he was dragged down into the darkness, into the hell they had unleashed. The woods were silent again, the wind dying down, the clearing empty. The witches had had their revenge, and the midnight ritual was complete. No one ever found the bodies. No one ever knew what happened to those stupid boys who went looking for trouble in Dunree Woods. But the old men at O'Malley's? They knew, they always knew. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some rituals aren't meant to be performed. And some places should just be left the fuck alone.